Long before factories and insulation, people noticed a strange kind of stone that behaved like cloth. When it was pulled apart, it made soft, pale fibers that could be twisted and woven. The shock came next. It did not burn the way other fabric burned. It endured heat that destroyed ordinary materials. In a world ruled by fire, that resistance felt unnatural. And anything that resisted fire invited attention. As the material appeared in different parts of the ancient world, it stayed rare. It was difficult to find, difficult to work, and valuable precisely because it seemed to ignore a basic rule of life. It served small, controlled uses. Luxury items meant to impress, or ritual objects meant to prove purity and power. Fire became the test. If the cloth came out intact, the message landed. This was not ordinary fiber. It was a marvel. That reputation spread farther than the material itself. Writers described it, traders carried small samples, and elites treated it like a curiosity that money could summon. People focused on what it did, not what it was. They saw a fabric that survived flames and assumed it carried a special quality, almost a blessing. No one measured dust. No one counted breaths. In this first chapter of Asbestos, wonder led the way and risk stayed invisible. The Industrial Revolution changed the scale of everything, and asbestos changed with it. Demand rose for materials that tolerated heat, friction, and steam. Small deposits that once fed odd, limited uses no longer seemed sufficient. Mining shifted from scattered collecting to planned extraction. New roads and rail links carried heavier loads. In a world built on boilers and engines, asbestos stopped being rare. It started looking like an answer. Mechanized processing made that answer practical. Crushing and milling equipment separated tough fibers from rock faster than hand labor ever managed. Factories treated asbestos less like a mineral and more like a raw ingredient, graded by length and quality. Consistent supply mattered because manufacturers needed predictable batches for large orders. Volume followed. Once production became repeatable, asbestos became something industry could rely on, not just admire. Then the uses multiplied, because the new industrial world created endless points of heat and wear. Asbestos went into insulation around pipes, wrapped around engines and mixed into cement and other compounds where strength and fire resistance paid off. It travelled farther and entered more workplaces than ever before. The shift was simple but decisive. A curiosity became a commodity, and commodities, once profitable, rarely stayed small. In the early 1900s, asbestos stopped being sold quietly to factories and started being sold loudly to the public. Manufacturers pushed it as a modern answer to modern fears: fire, heat, and breakdown. They called it a miracle material because it seemed to do everything at once. It strengthened cement. It quieted sound. It resisted flames. And it looked like progress. The message landed. Demand climbed fast. Industry moved first. Shipbuilders packed asbestos into engine rooms and boiler spaces where heat punished every other material. Power plants and factories wrapped pipes and turbines in thick insulation that kept energy in and costs down. Builders mixed asbestos into wallboard, flooring, and roofing because it lasted and it met new expectations for safety. It fit the age of speed and scale. One fibre solved 100 problems. That simplicity sold. Then asbestos crossed the threshold into ordinary homes. It appeared in stove and ironing board pads, in heat-resistant gloves, in textured paints and patching compounds, even in some filters and appliances. It slipped into products that people handled, cut, sanded and installed themselves. The wider it spread, the more invisible it became. It was no longer a special industrial ingredient. It became part of everyday life. That was the turning point. As asbestos spread through industry, a quieter record began forming alongside the sales claims. Doctors who treated workers noticed a pattern they could not ignore. Men from mills and insulation shops arrived with the same stubborn breathlessness, the same dry cough, the same exhaustion that did not match their age. Ordinary lung infections came and went. This did not. Something in the job seemed to mark the lungs slowly and permanently. Insurance companies and workplace doctors started writing it down because sickness meant payouts and lost labor. Medical reports described lungs that looked scarred and stiff, as if they had been tightened from the inside. The cases clustered in the same places: factories where asbestos was cut, carded, or spun into dust. The timeline mattered. The illness appeared after years, not days, which made it easy to miss at first and hard to dismiss once the files grew. Those documents turned suspicion into an early warning. They linked exposure to a distinct kind of lung damage, not just bad air or weak workers. The message was simple and unsettling. The material did not only resist fire, it also resisted the body's ability to clear it. Each breath in a dusty shop carried tiny fibers deep into the chest, and the harm added up quietly. For the first time, the medical trail pointed back to asbestos itself. As the medical warnings grew harder to ignore, the companies that mined and sold asbestos moved quickly to control the story. Reports of sick workers got treated as exceptions, not proof. Doubt became a tool. Executives leaned on friendly experts and selective statistics, and they framed the problem as unsettled science. If certainty could be delayed, responsibility could be delayed too. Inside plants and mines, that delay carried a cost. Information stayed locked in reports, memos, and insurance files instead of reaching the people breathing the dust. Safety changes came slowly, if they came at all, because admitting danger meant admitting fault. Public messages stayed upbeat, and sales materials kept praising asbestos as dependable and harmless. Production lines kept moving, and orders kept climbing. The pattern settled in: challenge the evidence, minimize the risk, keep output rising. Each year of dispute bought more time for business and less time for prevention. Workers stayed in the dark about what exposure could do decades later, and consumers never learned that ordinary products carried a hidden hazard. By the time the damage appeared, it looked like bad luck, not a predictable result. After World War II, the world rebuilt at speed. Cities expanded, suburbs spread, and new factories and offices appeared almost overnight. Builders needed materials that seemed modern, cheap, durable, and hard to burn. Asbestos fit that demand perfectly. It went into insulation, cement products, ceiling panels, roofing, floor tiles, and fireproof coatings. What had once been concentrated in heavy industry now entered ordinary construction as a standard ingredient. This shift changed who got exposed. The risk no longer stayed inside mines and plants. It followed the construction boom into schools, hospitals, apartments, and public buildings. Workers drilled, cut, sanded, and sprayed asbestos-containing materials, releasing fibers as part of routine jobs. Maintenance crews disturbed it again during repairs. Even people who never worked with asbestos directly lived and worked around it, breathing what they could not see and rarely suspected. Asbestos also settled into consumer life. It appeared in household products and building supplies, sold as safe and sensible choices, because it promised protection from heat and fire. The more it was used, the more normal it seemed. That was the turning point. Exposure became widespread, repeated, and often unnoticed, day after day. A material promoted for safety ended up spreading a hidden hazard through the places where people spent most of their lives. By the 1960s, the danger no longer looked like a vague occupational illness. It looked like a specific cancer with a name, mesothelioma. Doctors noticed it again and again in people who had worked with asbestos, even when that exposure had ended decades earlier. The timing mattered. The disease appeared long after the job, long after the dust. That delay made asbestos harder to blame and easier to ignore. Then the evidence hardened. Studies tied asbestos not just to damaged lungs, but to cancers of the lining around the lungs and to other serious tumours. Researchers compared groups, tracked work histories, and found the same pattern repeating. More exposure meant more risk. The old idea of a safe level started to collapse. If tiny fibres could lodge deep and stay there, time itself became part of the hazard. As the 1970s arrived, the message reached beyond medical journals. Reports spread through news coverage, unions, and courtroom testimony, and the public started to connect everyday products with deadly outcomes. Asbestos stopped sounding like protection and started sounding like contamination. The shift felt irreversible. What had been sold as a modern shield against fire now carried a different label. A slow-acting poison built into daily life and waiting years to strike. Once the danger became hard to deny, governments faced a choice: treat asbestos like any other industrial product or treat it like a threat. They began moving, not all at once, and not all in the same way. Some countries set exposure limits for workplaces. Others restricted specific products. The logic shifted. If asbestos could not be made safe by good intentions, then safety had to be enforced. Rules followed a pattern. Factories and construction sites had to measure dust levels, use protective gear, and train workers. Labels and warnings appeared where none had existed. Permits and inspections turned asbestos work into something controlled, not casual. But regulation also exposed a hard truth. Asbestos already sat inside millions of buildings. It had been sprayed, wrapped, mixed, and sealed into everyday structures. That reality forced a second wave of policy, removal and management. Governments issued guidelines that treated disturbance as the real trigger because cutting, drilling, or demolition released the fibres again. Specialised contractors and disposal rules became the new normal. In some places, bans arrived piece by piece, then more broadly. Asbestos did not vanish overnight. It changed status from standard material to regulated hazard. For years, the damage stayed hidden. People worked with asbestos, went home, raised families, and believed the danger had passed once the dust stopped. But the diseases did not arrive quickly. They waited. Decades later, former workers and ordinary building occupants started receiving the same shocking diagnoses, one after another. What looked like scattered illness turned into a pattern. And that pattern triggered a new fight: responsibility. Once doctors connected those late-stage cancers and lung diseases to old exposures, legal claims followed. Families filed suits after sudden deaths. Retired workers filed after years of unexplained breathlessness. Courts and companies faced a hard problem. The harm happened long ago, often at many job sites, from many products, under many owners. Still, the numbers kept climbing. The slow timeline that protected the industry now became the reason the flood arrived all at once. The cost was measured two ways, and both were brutal. On paper, settlements, verdicts, and compensation funds grew into billions, pushing some manufacturers into bankruptcy and forcing new systems to pay claims. In real life, the price was counted in lost years and exhausted caregivers, in treatment that often came too late, and in households suddenly without an income. The lawsuits did not just seek money. They revealed how widespread the exposure had been. In the present day, asbestos had not vanished. It stayed behind inside older buildings, packed into insulation, floor tiles, cement sheets, and pipe coverings that had been installed decades earlier. Much of it sat quietly, sealed and harmless, until something disturbed it. Renovations, storms, demolition, even routine maintenance turned hidden material into airborne dust. The danger did not look dramatic. It arrived as ordinary work. Regulation reshaped the problem, but it did not erase it. Rules demanded surveys, controlled removal, protective equipment, and special disposal, because the risk came from fibers too small to see. That meant the modern asbestos story became one of management. Identify it, contain it, remove it safely, and track the waste. Every step cost time and money, so corners still got cut. When that happened, exposure returned. And beyond older infrastructure, asbestos still remained in use in parts of the world, especially where it stayed cheap and building demand stayed high. The same promises repeated: strong, fire-resistant, reliable. The same outcome followed years later. Diseases with long delays kept appearing long after the original exposure, often in people who never knew they had been at risk. The ancient fireproof marvel ended as a preventable legacy.